Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 21st meeting of the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. Our first agenda item is a decision on whether to take items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Agenda item 3 is consideration of proposed changes in relation to the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016. Item 4 is consideration of a draft report from the Chair of the independent review of the process for determining electoral boundaries in Scotland. And item 5 is consideration of a complaint about a cross-party group. Are members content to take those in private? I'm grateful. I have also, my apologies both to the member and to those watching, received apologies from Annie Wells this morning, who won't be joining us. Our second agenda item is returning to the next stage of evidence on the Freedom of Information Reform Scotland Bill. And we are joined for this item this morning by Katie Clark, MSP. Good morning, Katie, who introduced the bill. And I'd also like to welcome Gordon Martin, who's joining us as Regional Organiser and Lead Officer for Calmac Ferries RMT Union. Good morning, Gordon. And Dr Kenneth Meakin, Head of Information and Data Protection Officer for Glasgow City Council. Can I thank you both for joining us this morning? And we will move directly to questions. And as is the privilege of the convener, I get to go first. So, good morning. My first question relates really to the policy memorandum that sat behind this bill and its principal aim about improving transparency by strengthening existing measures in both FOISA and deliver recommendations from the previous session's committee report on this. So really, I'll come to you first, Gordon, if I may. How timely are these changes and are they needed?
Most definitely needed. First of all, thanks for the invite to come along this morning, but most definitely needed. Timely, yes, but that depends on the parliamentary process. I mean, I would hope, RMT would hope, that this will be granted sufficient parliamentary time by the government, the committee is allowed to do its work and get this in place before the Parliament goes into recess for the election next May. That's certainly what the RMT are hoping happens. And I think it is timely with regard to that because, and I'll touch on it later on, you know, we've put in freedom of information requests fairly recently. Companies that are government funded and been declined, so the legislation has to go further and things have to be far more accountable than they currently are.
So the time is right now for the change, and actually there's an imperative that it happens this session rather than waiting further on.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. Kenneth, and comments about urgency, timeliness of it?
From my own organisation's perspective, we support the transparency agenda, but our perception is that if it's not broke, don't try to fix it. Speaking before the session there, very, very few requests made to my organisation actually result in us being ordered to release information by the Commissioner. Current figures are around about 2,500 requests result in information that we're ordered to disclose that we had previously withheld. So 20 years of FOI, we've processed, must be sitting at somewhere around 56,000 FOI requests. Most of whom get what they were asking for without any further ado.
So you have confidence that the existing system that we have, that this bill is seeking to enhance, is working fine, maybe some small changes, but no fundamental changes needed?
I don't see a need for fundamental change.
Okay.
Some of the proposals in terms of, you know, should we extend it to modern apps, WhatsApp being the classic example.
Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, it's already in scope.
Yeah. So do you think the nature or the environment of openness from public authorities in practice, do you not think that this bill would allow them to take that next step forward? And as you say, you are, you know, those who represent you are very open in the responses that you make. But do you not think it would aid all public authorities being able to make that step to being more open, effectively, to the people who are funding them?
I'd like to think we already are. With 20 years of exposure to this legislation, anyone working in the public sector has to be aware that we are subject to this legislation. We operate in that almost goldfish bowl environment at the moment, where we know that our decisions, rightly so, can be open to scrutiny and external investigation and inquiry. And that's absolutely right. Completely support the principles of transparency. The bill's measures, I think, would result in some improvements to the processes overall. The question, to my mind, is whether or not they're proportionate, given the resource implications that they would carry with them.
And certainly, I think we'll look at that in subsequent questions. Gordon, if I just come back to you, do you think it will add to the openness, the proposals in this bill?
Well, that's certainly got to be the intention behind it, and it definitely should, and widen the scope completely. For example, you touched on a deal with CalMac for the RMT. CalMac are subject to freedom of information, but other companies we deal with, publicly funded Serco Northlink ferries, for example, are not subjected to freedom of information scrutiny. So there has to be a level playing field as far as I'm concerned, and where public money is used to provide a public service, in our case transport, then yes, absolutely, the full scrutiny should be available.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ruth, can I pass over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Thanks for being with us. Section 1 of the bill proposes an amendment to the general entitlement to insert a presumption in favour of disclosure. Most respondents to the committee's views, call for views, were in favour of that. If I can ask Kenneth Meehan on behalf of Glasgow City Council first. First, I suppose, I'm kind of struck by your phrase there that the position would be, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And I wonder if the people requesting information would have that view as well. Obviously, we have to look at things in the round, not just from the providers of information, but from those who are trying to achieve it. But can I ask you how you currently decide whether to disclose information when applying qualified exemptions, and how a presumption in favour of disclosure might change an approach to practice in that regard?
In organisational terms, the initial request, the decision on releasing or not releasing, will be taken by the operational unit in question. So my involvement comes in more at the review stage, when we are effectively having a second assessment as to whether or not we thought the department that responded initially called it correctly. At that stage, we really insist on people, what will happen, what will go wrong if we actually release this information. Our reliance on qualified exemptions, certainly the ones that come to the review stage that I have visibility of, are fairly limited. We do have a robust process of challenging people that say, oh, if we release this, we will be charged several £1 million more next time we go out to tender.
Excuse me.
An example of commercial interest one. We've been required...
Is the commercial interest one that comes up a lot?
Less than it used to. In the early days of FOI, we were almost, as a matter of routine, unsuccessful bidders for council contracts would all ask to see the successful bidders tender and the tender evaluation sheets and everything else. So we had a lot of that in the early days of FOI. That is not so prevalent now. So we still get asked about commercial contracting details. We tend to be very open about giving out headline figures. When you start getting into the breakdown that would actually disclose the pricing models of a contractor, we tend to be a bit more reticent about releasing that level of detail. But certainly, generally would be happy to release headline information. How much did you spend on widgets? We spent £5 million on widgets last year. Okay,
thank you. And Gordon Martin, if I can come to you now from the perspective of the RMT, can you share your reflections on introducing a presumption in favour of disclosure? Do you think that would change the way public authorities engage with information requesters?
Yes, it most definitely should. As I've said earlier on, it should be, in our view, broadened as far as possible to include anything where there's public money used, whether it be the transport, Glasgow City Council, anywhere else. In our view, there must be full transparency, and I think the citizens of this country deserve and expect nothing less So I think the time has come for full transparency to be available, and too many companies, too many organisations hide behind commercial sensitivity and stuff like that, whereas when public money is being utilised, everybody's got the right to know, is it being utilised properly?
Would you agree that this would have a positive impact on
Absolutely,
public
yes.
trust and confidence in the process?
Yeah. If implemented in full, and we'll certainly lobby and campaign for that.
Okay, thank you. Kenneth, if I can come back to you, do you have any a view on whether a presumption in favour of disclosure would change how those seeking information behave in response to being told that information is withheld?
That's difficult to answer. Clearly, we're not allowed to ask why applicants want particular information. So there's a limited engagement we can have with the requesters in terms of that. Very often, applicants will volunteer the reason why they want to do it, which might have a bearing in our Public Interest Balancing Act. Sometimes it can. But as said in the written evidence, we already effectively apply a presumption of disclosure. So if we're asked for information, we require someone to come up with a good justification for withholding it. We never withhold personal data aside. I shouldn't say personal data aside. We always apply the presumption that information should be released unless someone can demonstrate why it shouldn't be.
Okay, and just finally, Gordon, if I can come back to you from the perspective of being an information requester, do you think that presumption might encourage users to be more proactive in seeking reviews and appeals of decisions if the presumption was there?
That may very well be the case, yes. I mean, I don't know and understand the way some corporations, some companies think, you know, including companies in the public sector. And I'll give an example, a live, fairly recent example, Caledonian Sleeper. I asked them, through normal industrial relations, a particular question about money they were given to an outside party to do shunting work, you know, join the train at Carstairs. They wouldn't give me it. Put in a Freedom of Information request, and it was declined on commercial sensitivity. Now, to me, that was, and still is, but at that time in particular, maybe May, June time, was at serious risk of causing industrial conflict between us and that particular employer. Whereas for me, that information should be readily available so as we can work out a solution to the problem. But if information's been withheld from us, it then provokes further suspicion on our part rather than good faith and good industrial relations. So from an industrial relations standpoint, and you know, certainly in the transport sector, I think it can only be a good thing.
Okay, thanks. It's helpful to have that on the record. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Gordon, can I just ask, Kenneth was saying that there's been, in his experience, a reduction of the reliance on that commercial sensitivity in blocking a freedom of information. Is that your experience, that you've seen a decline to your requests being refused on the grounds of commercial sensitivity, or is your experience different?
A bit of both, I've got to say.
Right.
You know, the recent example I just gave there was a surprise about Caledonian Sleeper. You know, in my opinion, there was no reason for them not to give us that information. They declined it through a Freedom of Information request. They denied it through the Parliament, through parliamentary request. So, so a bit mixed. And then in other cases, we approach Network Rail and others for information. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't, and it's a bit as to why, a bit unclear as to why we don't get it at times.
So, Kenneth, can I ask if you can share this? What's the sort of major reason that refusals are now happening if it's not commercial sensitivity under that limited? What is it that you're being confronted with as not to disclose by the frontline units?
The personal data exemption is the one that we cite most often.
Right.
I think, and to be fair, most applicants don't understand the subtle distinction between requests under data protection legislation and requests under freedom of information. It's unusual for there not to be some personal data wrapped up in the information we're asked for. So we do a major exercise of having to redact a lot of particularly third-party personal information. We will generally release the bulk of the information, but it will have the names blocked out.
Yeah.
But that is by far the most common, the most prevalent exemption we rely on.
Thank you. Emma, can I come to you? Hopefully.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, convener. Sorry. Good morning to the witnesses. I would like to ask, first of all, if you support the proposal for Parliament to have a more active role in reviewing Section 5 reports, and whether, in your view, this would lead to parliamentary scrutiny that is more timely and transparent in terms of designating bodies.
Gordon, can I come to you first?
Yes, is the short answer. As I say, we want full transparency, or as much transparency as humanly possible. You know, it is taxpayers' money. You know, things are hard for working class people, working class communities. Nobody wants to see public money being squandered. So we want it to be accountable, and you guys as the parliamentarians are ultimately responsible for that and should be held to account for your actions and omissions in relation to it. So absolutely, yes.
Kenneth, can I come to you?
We didn't have a particular view on that element of the legislation.
That's fine. Emma.
Is there any more then that you think could be done to ensure that FOI rights are keeping pace with changes in how public services are delivered?
That to you, Gordon.
I don't really think I could give a comprehensive answer.
No, that's fine. Anything you want to add on the...
No, the legislation at the moment is technology agnostic. So there's a lot of discussion around, do we need to reflect changes in technology and social innovation in that space? Because it is technology agnostic, I don't think we do need to do it. I think the legislation has managed to keep pace with the changes we've seen.
I think Emma's question was more about the delivery of services and how that's changing. And I think, you know, this stuff's been...
my own council, if you go back to when FOI came in originally, we had set up a number of arm's length external organisations. We had structured them in a way that they were almost all initially were subject to freedom of information legislation. So moving to the ALIO service delivery model didn't actually, in our case, deprive anyone of freedom of information rights. And it was the legislation passed to bring in culture and leisure trusts because of that perception that people had lost FOI rights in that space. Our culture and leisure trust was subject to FOI from the outset. So it is possible to have alternative service delivery models that don't deprive people of their FOI rights.
That's helpful. Emma?
Yeah, I think that is really helpful. And in terms of when that is not quite as clear cut and people may struggle to get information that they are looking for, Unison and others have suggested in evidence to the committee that FOI rights should follow the public pound. So would a criteria or a funding-based approach to designation of public bodies be more desirable for information requesters than the current kind of organisation by organisation model?
Gordon?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, providing this information obviously has got a cost attached to it, but what's the cost of not doing it? You know, it drives the wrong behaviours, the wrong thinking, so yeah, I think...
But a model that effectively followed where the public expenditure was being spent, wherever that was being spent, FOI should apply to that journey.
Yeah, absolutely, because it is taxpayers' money, it's public money. People are finding it hard at the moment and have been for a considerable number of years, so anything that's spent in the public sector, I think, if people want to know the whys and wherefores, have got the right to that information, yeah.
Yep. Kenneth?
We didn't express a particular view on this. What I would say is that if you were moving away from the list approach that we have at the moment to a more open-ended interpretative scope for FOI, it does lose the certainty, and there are risks associated with that. If an organisation, for example, was subject to FOI and hadn't appreciated it was subject to FOI, that then raises questions in terms of the proposed offence or a failure to appoint an FOI officer, for example. So, while we don't have a formal view on this, I would caution the committee that moving away from the list approach, you do lose the certainty that we have at the moment.
Okay. I think Sue has just a follow-up question, Emma. Sue, can I come to you?
Yes, Kenneth, it was on your comment about when we moved to the ALIO approach, it didn't impact the FOI requesting. And I'm just curious, you seem to be quite open and transparent in terms of that culture in the council in Glasgow. Do you think it might be dependent on the ability of other organisations to perhaps have that same mindset that you have, to be as transparent and for these things not to impact on requests?
Again, it's hard for me to actually speak for other organisations. I do chair a network of local authority representatives in this space, and I don't think our approach is fundamentally different in principle to the approach taken by the other local authorities. And when we have discussions about the round-robin requests that are made to all 32 local authorities, you know, we independently all reached much the same conclusion. So it's hard for me to say.
It's not always about local authorities.
I know, that's the sector I'm most familiar with.
I understand that. So I'm just trying to figure out that culture piece of an organisation, whereas you seem to be quite open. That's my question.
That's right. No. Is that you finished, Emma? Thank you. Sue, I'll come to you then.
Me now, thanks very much. This is some questions around, if you can, we've had some evidence submitted to us around the current approach to clarifying the information requests, where the time for compliance resets things, can feel somewhat adversarial to those that are requesting the information. I'll come to yourself, Dr.
Yeah, we're not supportive of the proposal. I understand from the perspective of an applicant, if you put a request in and on day 19 you get told, sorry, what did you mean? You know, that will substantially increase the amount of time it takes you to get the substantive response. But from perspective of the information holders, very often we get asked extremely technical questions. There are a lot of very well-informed applicants out there using this legislation, and the more technical the question becomes, the more you need somebody who actually understands the discipline to actually be able to analyse a question and say, you know, as an expert in this field, I have to say it's unclear if they're meaning this or this, but it won't necessarily be day one of us receiving the request before we find out. And we're a very large organisation, and even though we've got a well-established network of feeder channels that we would send requests down based on my own team having been working in this space for a long time, have a pretty good idea where it's likely that we hold the information, but it isn't an instantaneous process. So even though we do our best to expedite it and get the information requests out to the services and departments for them to assess, there will be a time lag in there, and we can't do any meaningful searches until that point. So if the clock was stopped, if we take 10 days to actually find someone who understands what the question means and says, we need to actually ask for clarification on this point, when the request comes in as clarified, that only gives us 10 days rather than 20 to actually find the information that's in scope with it and determine any relevant exemptions, carry out the redactions, and so on and so forth.
So do you believe that the pause mechanism would lead to a better relationship then between local authority and the public on these things?
No, the problem we would have is significant difficulty in complying with it, and it's not through... We don't sit on requests and then issue a day 19 clarification request as a stalling tactic. It's not my style. And under my leadership, it's not the team's style.
I get a sense from the culture that, yes...
So that's not something we do. And it would be problematic for us. With the best will in the world, it would be problematic if you have a pause mechanism. The other point as well is that clarified requests usually aren't just a clarified request. You know, after the applicant has had a wee chance to think about it on the back of us saying, what do you mean here? Typically, they will also add in some additional parts.
Okay.
So we get fresh requests in as well. So if you had a pause mechanism, we'd be sitting there going, which parts are under the pause timescale and which ones are completely fresh requests where we're on day 1 of 20.
And what sort of impact would that have on the resourcing within your team then as well?
The impact would be more felt, I think, actually out in the services that hold the information.
Okay.
That's always a hard one to quantify. You see the evidence on how much does it cost to comply with an FOI request. I don't know.
Yeah. The time, the resource.
The time, resource, it is time-consuming. It is difficult. And sometimes, even in a large organisation like ours, we consist of an awful large number of fairly small teams. So we get an FOI request in, and in practical terms, there might only be one person or two people that can deal with the information request. And if they're having to commit up to 40 hours of time on that request, that does have a significant impact on their ability to do the rest of their job.
We did hear last week, I think, that most of the information given the legal requirements around data should be heard, and it should be quite quick, and you should be able to respond to this. But are you suggesting that might not be the case in reality?
The reality is we're not awash with money. So if you take your IT estate, public bodies, and certainly my own organisation, we do what's known in the jargon as sweating assets.
Okay.
In private sector, a laptop has an expected life of 3 years and a desktop computer 5 years. Remember desktop computers? We will tend to run it for 5 years plus for a laptop, simply because it saves money. So technology tends to get a little bit older as a result of that. So much as we would love to have all singing, all dancing IT systems that would allow us to interrogate the data at the drop of a hat, typically we don't. We have line of business applications that were built for a specific purpose and which aren't necessarily well designed in terms of then using them for data mining of the type you're describing.
That's helpful. Gordon, do you have anything on this that you want to add?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, as a freedom of information requester, as opposed to Kenneth's perspective, very often we feel it is a stalling tactic. Now, I appreciate the points Kenneth's just made. Sometimes it can be fairly technical. But the companies we deal with, they're very publicly funded, they're big organisations, and they should have the staffing levels to be able to get us the answers. It's railway or ferry companies we're asking the questions of, and these are experts in the ferry and rail sector. So it shouldn't be difficult to get meaningful answers, and yes, we do support the pause mechanism.
And how do you think the pause mechanism will make it better for a requester like yourself?
Well, it's very, very frustrating when you get to day 19, for example, and can you clarify what you mean? So with a pause mechanism, the clock will be paused, but it will start ticking again at a given point, and the answer is still expected to be given. So we're hopeful that if that comes in, that will assist and bring a bit more transparency to the situation.
Okay, and I suppose that goes back to some might say.
Can I just before you move on, Gordon, do you find, so Kenneth said that they're trying to answer they actively try and answer the freedom of information as soon as possible, and it's not a case of waiting till day 19. Is that your experience with other industries, or is your experience actually that you're seeing a frequent wait till day sort of 15, 16, and then the request comes back for the clarification? On occasion,
yes, absolutely, that happens. And from my perspective, there doesn't appear to be any particular need for it. Right. It's as if they're trying to stalling tactics, to use Kenneth's words.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, in terms of that sort of feeds the rhetoric that it's an adversarial approach to this information.
And it shouldn't be. We don't want it to be like that, but it should. It's very often, not very often, but from time to time, it does happen.
Okay, thanks. This bill is proposing to replace publication schemes with a statutory duty of proactive publication and a code of practice. So I'll come to yourself first, Kenneth. What opportunities and challenges do you see in implementing this duty?
The publication scheme model doesn't work.
Okay.
I pulled the figures. I pulled the figures for our own publication scheme. Not so much the publication scheme; it's the guide to information that sits underneath the publication scheme. The model publication scheme published by the Commissioner sets out classes of information. You're expected to produce a guide to information that sits under that. That actually says, here's what we've got that we publish at the moment. It is a difficult document to maintain. So anytime we re-platform our website, the information management team have a big painting the fourth bridge job of fixing all the broken links that are contained within it. And at the end of the day, over the last, I think I checked figures for about 10 months worth of data, 26 people looked at our guide to information and downloaded it. And it's a lot of effort for not a lot of return. It's not the public's preferred way of accessing information. They're more likely just to use the search function in a website to find the information rather than use the guide to information. So support getting rid of guides to information. The proactive publication duty, not opposed to that in principle. We would simply want it to be recognised that this is not resource neutral. I think the financial memorandum suggests that there's a cost saving associated with this. I have to fundamentally disagree with that. We previously had, it was called the City Observatory. So it was UK government technology funding that we used to set it up. But once that one-off funding had run out, we had no resource to maintain the City Observatory, which was kind of a real-time dashboard of information about the city. So it's proactive publication of a lot of information that we did not have a resource to maintain. And that's a worked example, if you like, of the fact that without adequate resources, maintaining proactive publication is extremely difficult. We found it useful on isolated cases where we've done something controversial that's resulted in multiple FOI requests to the Council, and I say multiple, and sometimes this can get into the hundreds. We found it useful in those cases to do the proactive publication to try and stem that flow. But that's a reactive, proactive publication, if I can put it that way. We've only identified the fact that there's a big interest in that information because we've received the requests for it. The requests we get are so diverse that it's very hard for us to predict what information that we don't already publish would be of interest to the public. Certainly, we publish a lot of information. We have an extremely transparent decision-making process through the council meetings and council committees where all the key decisions are taken. That information is already in the public domain. There are provisions under the Access to Information Act that we can exclude press and public and not publish committee reports. That's a very, very unusual power for my council to utilise. It's a rare event for us to exclude press and public from an operational decision in that way.
So in your view then, do you think the public sector in Scotland is ready to implement that sort of proactive duty to publish? And you have spoken about some of the challenges in terms of resource and support, so technical, financial and cultural. What do you think might be needed to make it effective?
Effectiveness, again, it's a hard one to gauge because we could, if the magic money trees bloomed again, one can always hope, and we had the sufficient resources to actually say, here's a whole raft load of data that we're going to proactively publish, but we won't know what demand there is for that until we've published it, and then we start analysing which parts were people looking at, which data sets were being downloaded. So you can't easily judge the success ahead of doing it. And that's part of the challenge as well. It's like, what information that we don't already publish would we be expected to publish? And there's a suggestion that the Code of Practice on proactive publication will impose significant obligations on public authorities. So you're being asked to legislate to impose significant burdens on public authorities, and we are unsighted as to what those might be.
Yeah, okay. Gordon, in terms of...
So I think Ruth just has a little follow-up for Kenneth,
sorry.
is it? Yeah.
No, it's
really briefly, thank you. Convener, Kenneth Meakin, I would acknowledge what you're saying about meetings being in public and decisions being taken in public and that being transparent, but is it not the case for local authorities that there will be pre-meets between officials and politicians before the public part of the meeting? So while I would acknowledge that often these meetings are even live streamed, so they're very accessible now, that's actually not the whole picture in terms of decision making for local authorities.
The pre-meetings I've been party to have largely been procedural ones, in the sense of, who's going to come along and speak to this report. They're of that nature. We don't have a pre-meeting where there's a predetermined outcome for what will happen at the public meeting. I've never been involved in a pre-meeting where that's been the case.
Okay.
Gordon, in terms of the proactive publication was there, what opportunities would that provide yourself as someone requesting information? How can you see that benefiting yourself?
I would like to think it would take the adversarial kind of content out of it. It's you're asking a reasonable question, you expect a reasonable answer. But what I can see, and I'm just thinking as Kenneth was talking, I can see this ending up with lawyers crawling all over it, and things that should be freely available, it then becomes a code of practice, I know from experience in my own job, code of practices set out with good intentions and very often become a bureaucratic minefield. And I see you laughing there, Chair. I think you know exactly what I'm saying.
Creates a whole new industry.
Yeah, exactly that. So, but hopefully that won't happen, because all this should be as a democratic function in a democratic society, giving people the right to know, holding people accountable, including you guys as MSPs, ultimately. And I don't think we're asking for much with that. I really don't.
Okay, thank you. This is a question just specific to yourself, Kenneth. The proposal to designate a Freedom of Information Officer in each public authority draws on models from records management and data protection law. How feasible is designating this role for your organisation, or if you can maybe think about other public authorities more widely?
Okay, all public authorities are subject to FOI are also public authorities are required to have a designated data protection officer. So the easy option for any public authority, if this is implemented, is simply to say you're now the Freedom of Information Officer as well as a data protection officer. I don't want to put words into the mouths of my superiors, but I have a strong suspicion that that might well be what would happen within Glasgow. Which
are they complementary duties then?
They should be. Yeah. They should be. You know, if you had a separate FOI officer and a data protection officer, I can't imagine them ever actually coming at loggerheads for the FOI officer saying, release it, and the data protection officer saying, oh, no, you don't. The FOI officer should be aware if it is a different person, and I very much doubt it will be in many cases. But the FOI officer should be cognizant of the exemptions for personal data that already exist in the legislation. I don't see any inherent conflict there. If there were a conflict for some reason, then the data protection officer can't act in a conflict of interest situation. That's what's already in the UK GDPR. But if even within my own organisation, I'm the data protection officer, but there's a large element of our data protection compliance is done by a separate department that I don't have direct operational oversight for. I'm still a single point of contact if the Information Commissioner wants to discuss what that department's doing. So there is a slight issue that we have there. Compared to a lot of other authorities, we've actually got quite a centralised FOI model. It's certainly going to be slightly more centralised still, which, if you've got a central team, having an FOI officer designated as being responsible for that team kind of makes sense. But I do know that a lot of other authorities have a very distributed model of FOI compliance, and actually then imposing the requirement to have a unitary FOI officer wouldn't sit comfortably with their organisational structures.
Okay. Do you think, what impact would professionalising that FOI officer then, that role, have on transparency and accountability?
I'd like to think we're quite professionalised in that space already.
Okay.
Gordon was saying about having lawyers all over. I should probably say at this point that I am actually a lawyer. None taken.
All right, okay.
But,
thank you.
Yeah, it is a professional activity. It is applying legislation. There is a scope for having legal advice in there. And I would imagine most FOI officers in a larger authority certainly will be legally qualified individuals. Smaller organisations might have difficulty if they don't have an appropriately skilled person. And it's quite prescriptive in terms of what your FOI officer needs to have and the resources that they have to have and so on and so forth. And particularly within the distributed model, or particularly within a smaller authority, I think there would be some difficulty in actually implementing that without, again, more resources.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So can I just delve into the sort of roles? So some of the information that we heard last week and indeed has been submitted also talks about the records management responsibility. I suppose, Kenneth, do you think there is something worth looking at and bringing together the sort of GDPR, the FOI and the records management? Because what you were talking about, the sort of architecture that exists in Glasgow, to move to proactive publication, there effectively needs to be a redesign of that to facilitate it, or it's going to be prohibitive.
There's already, in terms of the records management plan, that many, but not all, I should point that out, not every public authority subject to FOI is subject to the Public Records Scotland Act. But if you're looking at certainly the larger ones that are subject to Public Records Scotland Act, the records management plan is almost like a quilt that stitches together the different elements. So you've got elements of your records management plan that have to address information security, you have to address data protection, you have to address FOI, you have to address the wider records management sense of the care and feeding of your records. So all of those different strands are pulled together within the records management plan if you're subject to that legislation. Having a designated FOI officer, it would be another person that you would probably have to name in your submission to the keeper in terms of that.
Yes.
Within my own organisation, our records management plan, I should know this off the top of my head, 15 elements. I'm responsible for a number of those elements as Head of Information Data Protection Officer. I have an information governance manager who is responsible for a number of other elements. So we have a split responsibility at the moment in there. So
that's helpful. Was there anything else, Sue? Sorry. No. Okay. Thank you. Final set of questions, in a sense. Looking forward, one of the challenges is technology, but also one of the challenges is the sort of informal communication methods, the WhatsApps of this world, and such. What are your views on the fact that there is a potential that information that should be subject to freedom of information is potentially and indeed deliberately being put beyond the reach of it because of informal methods? What are your concerns or views on that? Gordon, if I come to you first.
Yeah, I think there's a very real possibility here. That, I mean, we all remember the COVID inquiry, both at the Parliament down the road here and this one, senior politicians sending each other messages via informal communication methods, and then when they were asked to produce it, were unable to or unwilling to, whatever the case may be. So, but there's always a risk in that, isn't there? There's always a risk that people will take stuff offline and won't WhatsApp. They'll just talk about stuff rather than putting anything in writing, any communication. So that is always a risk, but it doesn't undermine the fundamental argument that we need better freedom of information provision in Scotland at this time.
That's helpful. Kenneth?
You mentioned already, I'm of the view that if you're conducting official business, it doesn't matter what channel you're doing it over. If you chose to conduct that business over WhatsApp, which in the case of my organisation would be a breach of our policies, we have a very strict official business is done over official channels policy line. How you police that is a completely different question, but we've made a very firm policy statement to that effect that that's how we do business. If someone chooses to breach that and is using an informal channel, and we discover it, then I would regard that as already being subject to FOI legislation.
Mm-hmm. So as that brings me to sort of my final question, which is how workable then is the proposal to extend the offence of altering or destroying records to situations where no information requests yet been made. So no FOI has come in, but there's evidence that information has been, put beyond mean or destroyed. How workable do you think it is to make that action an offence? Not so much the question of whether it would come about, whether it would be discovered, but how workable is that, do we think? Gordon?
Well, I think you've got to put something in place, and there's got to be consequences for actions and omissions. How do you legislate for something that hasn't happened yet?
Yeah.
That is a $1 million question, but there must be notifiable consequences. So, if you're a senior executive or whatever it may be in a publicly funded company or Glasgow City Council or anything like that, you've got to anticipate that at some point what you're doing in 2025, somebody may ask for, well, why did that happen? What happened? So record keeping is going to be established, and that's why it's got to be official communications. But as I say, there's no way of stopping people going offline and doing stuff, and that will probably always happen.
Kenneth?
We're not supportive of this provision, simply because, well, there's quite a lot of reasons why. One is the uncertainty element. I've mentioned already the FOI requests that we get are incredibly varied. So we have no idea what somebody might ask for in future. Yes, there's key decisions that we know we will be asked for, and in terms of our existing records management practices and what we say out in our records management plan, any information supporting key decisions should be retained in the official repository for retaining that information for the length of time we set out in the retention schedule. So that information should be locked down and available for future scrutiny if anyone asks for it. But there's a lot of information that is peripheral, that's of no enduring value. And the danger we have is that this offence, if it's enacted, will lead to very defensive behaviours of the don't delete anything because I don't want to be accused of deleting all of that simply because somebody might ask for it in future. So you run the risk that we will over-retain data. You know, we have a data protection principle that says don't keep personal data for longer than necessary. We have an understanding at the moment of how long necessary is for different categories of data based on business need. But if you then have a situation where everyone's scared to get rid of anything, we just end up having a huge data berg, as it's known, a sprawl of information, and that costs money to store it. Whether it's paper, you know, we have archives in the Mitchell Library that are huge, so big that we've now got a huge warehouse up in Darnick Street in the north of Glasgow. It's also full of papers. I think the last time I was up there, I made an estimate that we've got 12 linear miles of paper files in that particular warehouse. But that costs money. You know, we need to have that physical facility and make it, you know, environmental conditions appropriate to retain those documents in. That costs money. Data costs money. The world is increasingly moving to a storage as a service model in the IT world, which means every little extra email that you're retaining, every draft document you would think, don't need that anymore, get rid of it, we've got the final version. You know, all of that costs money.
So do you think that outweighs the value of primary legislation saying it would be an offence, effectively, if you know there's something worrying here, for you deliberately to destroy or remove that from access? Do you think we can live with that without failing to put that up as a principle by which all public servants should do, and more than that, quite frankly, professionals should deal with, as compared to the cost of retaining all of this?
Yeah, the instances that Gordon referred to, and we're all aware of the WhatsApp sagas that came out of the inquiries. But it looked to me as though it was behaviour by a small number of individuals and a small number of organisations. So to actually apply this across the entire public sector without any evidence base, I have to say, when the bill was published originally, these provisions did come as something of a surprise to those of us working in this field. I don't think it's a proportionate response to what's been identified as the mischief there.
No, that's fine. Katie, can I come to you?
Thank you very much. Thank you. And if it's okay,
Please,
like to ask Kenneth a couple of questions, if that's okay. And it's very good to hear that the existing legislation is working very well for a large organisation such as Glasgow City Council. And the policy intention behind the bill is not to add costs to an organisation such as Glasgow, or indeed to move away from the structure of the existing legislation known as FOISA, where there's a designation, or I think you referred to it as a list process, but to build upon it based on the feedback over the last 20 years from organisations, the public, and indeed what the Information Commissioners are saying. So in relation to one of the changes that's suggested, which is the move towards proactive publication, do you think that the code of practice that the Information Commissioner will issue would assist local authorities, such as yourself, to know what needs to be proactively published, particularly given that we know from the evidence that technology and it has the ability to drive down the costs of publication?
Yeah, absolutely. I've mentioned already in response to an earlier question, we find it very hard to predict what we're going to be asked about. In some cases, we know that we've got an FOI request coming. You know, if something makes the headlines, you know, then we reasonably will predict, and usually correctly, that there will be FOI requests following on from that. But absent making headlines, it's hard for us to know So, yeah, we would be entirely dependent on code of practice to say this is what you should be looking at. Particularly, as I say, there is a resource implication there, and not wanting to be unhelpful, but, you know, I'm going to have to go to some kind of resourcing board to get additional resources to do anything that we're doing in this space, or the other parts of the organisation that are tasked with proactive publication of their data will need to find additional resources to do this. So it would be good to know that what we're doing is what is in line with the expectations laid down in that code of practice. It would be quite helpful if an indicative code of practice could be produced before the bill's actually passed, just to give us a bit more of a flavour for that and allow us to make a more informed submission to this committee as to what the resource implications of what's envisaged would actually look like. So at the moment I'm saying there will be a resource implication. I can't quantify that because I don't know what the expectation is in terms of volume of information to proactively publish, frequency of updating, structure of that data, and so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of huge number of unknowns in there, and having some sort of indicative code of practice would allow us to actually come back to you with a more detailed response to say, if we're expected to produce that, our analysis is annual running costs would be this amount. And we'd also then be able to say, oh, and we've had this many FOI requests that would have been addressed by that proactive publication, so therefore the reduction in FOI numbers would be X or Y. But I can't do that for you just now either. It's information we could produce if we had a better idea of what was going to be expected of us under that provision.
Thank you. And the proposal for an FOI officer having a statutory basis has come from FOI officers themselves over an extended period of time, long before I got involved in the issue. FOI officers in many organisations have said that they are having difficulties getting their organisations to comply with the legislation. I appreciate that doesn't sound as if it's at all the case in Glasgow, but in other organisations. And what FOI officers, who are often also data protection officers, are saying that they believe that having a similar statutory basis to data protection, and often it's the same person, particularly in smaller organisations that do both data protection and FOI, that would give them the authority in an organisation to insist that the law is complied with. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense. I don't have a problem with the idea of having a statutory FOI officer. It was just in terms of the prescriptive way it was set out in the draft bill at the moment might sit uncomfortable in some organisations, but I fully appreciate that if I were doing FOI and didn't have the benefit of being a statutory data protection officer as I am at the moment, I would probably be arguing to say, please give me a statutory designation so that I've got a bit more clout to say to the departments, you need to deal with this. You know, this isn't an add-on, this is part of our core statutory functions and you need to do that. So I haven't needed to wield that statutory clout myself, but I can fully understand that a number of my colleagues would welcome that. So, as I say, I don't have a problem with principle. Council doesn't have a problem with it in principle. We're just conscious that it won't sit quite as comfortably in all organisations.
Thank you. Have I got time for one?
Very short question.
Very short question. It was more about the criminal offence, and obviously the threshold for a criminal case is beyond reasonable doubt. And this new offence is perceived to be about closing a loophole, and it would have to be shown in court that someone was intending to avoid the law by destroying information. Do you think there are many times this legislation would be used, given that actually these criminal charges that already exist are very rarely used?
I would hope it would never be used.
Yes, exactly.
Being realistic. What I would have more of a fear of is that, and I don't want to take this out of proportion either, there are a small number of individuals who will weaponise FOI. And there is legislation at the moment that says we can regard a request as vexatious and refuse to comply with it. But in terms of the tests that we need, if we're going to do that and satisfy the Commissioner on appeal that we were correct in doing that, typically we have to take a few hits first. in terms of dealing with the request that we look at and think that's really quite obviously vexatious, but if we want to build a case to take to the Commissioner, we're going to have to deal with it a few times. These individuals are never satisfied, and I just fear that we're giving them an additional weapon that, on the one hand, they'll be going to the Commissioner saying we didn't deal with the request, and on the other hand, they'll be reporting to the police to say that we have deliberately concealed information, and that will tie up time and resources, both at our end and at the police's end, to follow up requests of complaints of that nature. I do have a fear about that, I have to say.
I think we've probably run out of time. Is that correct? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I thank you both for your evidence today? If something comes to mind subsequently, please feel free to get in touch with the committee, and I hope you don't mind if we have some additional questions that come along that we contact you in the future. But can I thank you for your evidence today, and I will suspend while we'll change panels. And can I welcome people back for our second panel this morning. And we are joined here by Chris Milne, who's the former chair of Scottish Higher Education Information Practitioners Group. And we're joined online by Fiona Stewart, who's the Privacy Subcommittee member of the Law Society of Scotland. Can I welcome you both to this committee? And we will move, if that's all right, straight to questions. Fiona, if I can come to you first. Again, the policy memorandum of this bill talked about an aim of improving transparency by strengthening measures to the freedom of information and to deliver the recommendations that came from the previous session of this Parliament some time ago. So how timely do you think these reforms are now? Fiona, if I come to you first. Hopefully. can you hear us? I can hear you, but I can't.
Thank you. Good morning.
Perfect. We can hear you now. Good morning, Fiona.
Thank you. That's me able to unmute. And in terms of timeliness, I'm not sure the Law Society has a specific view on that. However, what I would say is that we are reviewing the provisions and are open to processes that would continue to enhance transparency in Scotland.
Thank you. Chris, is it timely?
I think it's welcome. I think the legislation's obviously been in force for a number of years now, and it's useful to refresh it every now and then, just understand, is it meeting Parliament's wishes and the wishes of the public? It was interesting to see in the submissions the high rate of engagement from the public and use of the Act. I was particularly pleased to see that there appears to be a higher level of public engagement as a sector compared to the perception that it's predominantly journalists that the Act is for. So I felt that was quite a welcome development.
Thank you. And I suppose one of the questions that you raised in the evidence the Law Society submitted, Fiona, was parliamentary time and scrutiny. What are your comments about that, given where we are in the nature of this session?
Yes, that's correct. The Law Society did wish to express that view. Obviously, a lot of consideration has gone on into this with detailed comments provided, and it would be important that a conclusion was reached on that.
Which are the areas, just for the sort of public record, by way of today, do we need to scrutinise more?
So, in general, the view would be in particular concerns around the pausing of the 20-day limit for time for compliance. The proposed offence as well would require greater scrutiny from the Law Society's position, whilst support has been provided in respect of another a couple of provisions, including the appointment of the FOI officer and the sort of proactive publication duty. There are some elements of clarification to be made there around the content of a code of practice, for example, and how FOI officers may be resourced in smaller organisations, for example.
Thank you, Fiona. You've provided the perfect contents page for where our questions are going today. Ruth, can I come to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Some of the respondents to the committee's calls for views suggested that the proposal to introduce a presumption in favour of disclosure when public authorities are considering withholding information under a qualified exemption does not change the legal position of information disclosure under FISA, while others had concern about confusing the existing position of information disclosure under FISA. Can I ask for your opinion on and view on the proposal? If I come to Fiona Stewart first.
Thank you. Yes, the Law Society was unclear on this, largely because on one hand, there is already a sense that that is the position in place in Scotland and has been since implementation of the legislation, and it is very much repeated in decisions by the Scottish Information Commissioner. So there is a question around the necessity to include that. The Law Society did highlight in our call for views an opinion from Lord Marnock in relation to a decision where, whilst it was noted that, sorry, do bear with me a minute while I just double check, whilst it should be construed in as liberal a way as possible in terms of that general entitlement to disclose, it is important that it's not interpreted too widely without regard for other laws that were in place.
Thank you. That's helpful. Chris Milne, can I?
Thank you. Yeah, the position of the Scottish Higher Education Information Practitioners Group essentially is we believe the law is relatively clear at the moment. It does favour the release of information unless exemptions apply. From a practitioner's point of view and from a public point of view, that seems to be relatively clear, simple and straightforward. I wouldn't want to see anything perhaps that would complicate the position and dilute the advances already made in practitioners and in case law.
can you perhaps speak to how that presumption in favour of disclosure might change the practice of FOI officers in universities?
Not directly until such times as if it was ever tested as a point of law and there was new precedent that had to be observed in how we practice and respond to requests. But this consensus at the moment is it's relatively clear. When we receive requests, we look to answer them as fully as we can, but then we start to assess is there any harm from disclosure, and where that's believed, we would look for evidence and then seek to apply exemptions accordingly, or not, as the case may be.
Thank you, that's helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Emma, I'm going to come to you. Hopefully. Oh, there we are. Emma, can I come to you for your questions?
Sorry, Convener, it kept flashing up there. I don't know what was happening. Good morning to the witnesses. I've got a couple of questions for the Law Society. Firstly, do you support the proposal for Parliament to have a more active role in reviewing Section 5 reports? And in your view, would this parliamentary scrutiny lead to more timely and transparent designation of bodies?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, the Law Society did not express a view on that provision. I am, however, happy to take that away and report back in writing later, as I don't have a stated position on that.
Thank you.
Okay, kind of more generally then, the bill would give the Scottish Parliament power to designate organisations delivering public functions or services as public authorities. Do you have views on that approach?
I know I do have to apologise. It was one of the elements of the call for views that collectively that no views were expressed. So it's difficult for me to answer that today. So I am happy to take that back and come back with views that reflect the Law Society of Scotland.
I'm sure we'll look forward to the correspondence. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add there.
Essentially, the position of the Scottish Higher Education Information Practitioners Group was the same. It was something as a group we couldn't come to a view on because it's not something that we're intimately involved with. The one thing we did note in our submission, and which may be of relevance to your question in part, if I may, was the point that a lot of universities have subsidiary companies and start-ups, and extending the legislation to cover those start-ups could be welcomed, but it might be prudent to have a degree of caution in that, so that any legislative burden on the start-ups doesn't negate from the kind of purpose that they were set up to do and stifle innovation.
Thank you. I think you got away lightly there, Emma. Well done. And we look forward to the Law Society's response. Chris, can I just go back to the last question for a clarification? So, in other words, this change of definition and the presumption. Would you and those that you represent be confident that if effectively it was restated in the same terms, that would give you confidence that that those that you speak for understand what the expectation is? Whereas if this bill becomes law and even just changes it slightly, we're into an area of uncertainty that could lead consequently to problems of interpretation. Have I understood that correctly?
I think the view of the group is that it's very clearly stated at the moment, both in the legislation, the guidance and the precedents that have come down from the Court of Session and others.
So reliance on the existing interpretation, which is well understood, is more beneficial than risking long grass and perhaps misinterpretation going forward.
I think so, and if I may talk personally, I think there's something quite nice about the general entitlement. I think it sets the tone of the Act exceptionally well.
Thank you. Sorry, Sue, can I come over to you? Thank you.
Thank you. Fiona, earlier on you spoke about how there was some elements that needed a bit more scrutiny in the bill, and one was particular regarding the pause rather than the reset, the clock mechanism. So I was wondering, there was considerable support in the written evidence to us on that, for a pause rather than a reset the clock mechanism. Both the Law Society and the Scottish Higher Education Information Practitioners Group indicated that they don't support this, however. So I'm just wondering, why are you not supporting that move when to pausing the time for compliance when public authorities are seeking clarification?
Yep, thank you. Thanks. So really the reason for not supporting is probably based more on that experience and practice of managing requests for information, not solely, but perhaps particularly when they're received by a larger public authority that might have a more complex structure. So when the request comes in, it is not always within the knowledge of the FOI team, if there is one, as to how best to respond to that. So as a result of that, the FOI team have to contact subject matter experts across the organisation, and even with no intent to not expedite the request, that by its very nature can take time. And if that was to be paused, then the consequences of the proposal is that a public authority would have less time to respond to a request once clarification has been received, as you would have less than up to 20 working days to respond. Also, the experience is that sometimes when you receive clarification, it actually extends the extent and scope of the request, and thereby it is necessary for further time to be taken to respond to that. My final point is probably around the aim around enhancing transparency and openness, and actually there may be occasions where up to 20 working days are required to deliver a fully open and transparent and comprehensive response, and therefore a reduction of time does not necessarily mean that that enhances transparency.
Chris, what about yourself?
Yeah, the group I represent essentially came to the same view, predominantly from practitioner-based experience. It's not unusual for when clarifications asked for it to turn into a completely new request. And then that might mean that in many instances the time that the Act allows for a response is genuinely needed to not just source the information but to consider the extent to which it can be released or whether exemptions may apply. Our view also was that the legislation appears to be clear that requests should be answered as timelessly as possible, that the 20 days is a maximum. So if something's relatively simple, a public authority would be expected to answer relatively quickly, and that if an applicant felt that they weren't getting a timely response from a public authority, that could be a matter for internal review and then to the Commissioner for a decision. So we feel that there are safeguards there that allow for public authorities to manage the requests, but also, if there was abuse of the system, for that to be challenged.
So do you think there's benefits and protections with the current?
I believe there is, yes.
And yourself, Fiona? Do you believe?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I think, if I may, the difficulty with pausing is it runs the risk of more complaints and more internal reviews, and then that takes time away from answering requests in a timely manner, because obviously the resource burden shifts to dealing with internal reviews and then the other elements allied from that.
We heard this morning, in terms of the trust and sometimes the evasive techniques that respondents get, those that are responding to an FOI can deploy, that this would stop that from happening and give people more more. What are your thoughts on that? Because there will be organisations that aren't perhaps as open and timorous as yourself in responding that might use.
And if I may talk for the higher education sector, our statistics seem to be relatively strong in that area. Large volumes of requests, there doesn't seem to be a high degree of concern. It appeals to the Commissioner compared to other sectors. I'm not aware of any higher education institution having been censured or had a review for this particular point.
That's helpful, thank you. I've got a question specifically. There was considerable support for the repeal of the First Minister's veto power in evidence to the committee. but the Law Society indicated it does not support this proposal. So this is specifically a question for yourself, Fiona. Why do you not support the repeal of Section 52 in FOISA?
Thank you. The Law Society's view on this was that it wasn't supported simply because there was already sufficient safeguards in place with regard to the current provisions, namely that the decision must be made on reasonable grounds, which would be subject to judicial review, and also that it was limited in scope to specific exemptions which by their nature are likely to comprise more sensitive matters.
That's, to me, I'm just going back to the whole, the point of this is to be open and transparent and honest with the public. And can you not maybe see how this one element would go some way to really restore trust across the wider public, and the support, not supporting that removal of the, I'm getting mixed up with my notes, and you know, your position might be at odds with the rest of Scotland. It's where I am, I suppose, to be as blunt.
Yeah, I do understand and take your position. I think what I'm doing is just representing the sort of view that was expressed through the Law Society, and if further reflection has been requested, then I can take that back and again bring a follow-up response if that's helpful.
That would be helpful. It just seems a bit out of kilter with the rest of the evidence that we took. I've got some other questions as well, if you don't mind. It's on the proactive publication element of things. And we've spoken about the bill proposing to replace the publication schemes with a statutory duty of proactive publication and a code of practice. So what opportunities and challenges do you see in implementing this new duty? Can I come to yourself, Chris, first?
I think this would be a considerable opportunity to allow public authorities to proactively publish in a meaningful way that would reduce the FOI burden in managing requests. However, that's caveated. Potentially, we get lots of inquiries which potentially could be answered in a publication scheme, but they can't be, and then exempted under 25(1), but they can't be because the nature of the request is often looking for more up-to-date information than is present in the scheme. So, for example, if there was a code of practice for proactive publication, for argument's sake, for the publication of expenses, and the code of practice said that those had to be published 3 times a year, and there was an absolute exemption whereby if information was available through that framework, that would reduce requests considerably. And it's not just the burden on the FOI teams, it's the burden on other areas of the organisation to furnish and provide the information. But if someone wants an up-to-date expense as of yesterday, then that whole proactive publication would fail, we believe.
Yeah, that's a very helpful example and very live. Do you think the public sector is ready to implement that proactive duty to publish, and what sort of support might it need? All sorts of...
Talking for the higher education sector, I believe that we're probably increasingly ready to respond, given how information is created and published on intranets and the like. There's quite a lot of data management involved, but it would also encourage good records management, good metadata management, which could streamline publication.
Okay.
It would also be very useful, I believe, to get people to think about at the time of a record's creation how that record then ought to be managed throughout its life cycle. So if there were other public sector requirements on the record, such as archiving and so on and so forth, that might be a more efficient way of managing it with training and culture change.
All right, that's helpful. Fiona, do you want to respond to those questions?
Yes, thank you. In terms of the benefits of the proposal would be around the removal of the requirement for the publication scheme, which is no longer deemed fit for purpose, and also a proposal that's supported by a clear code of practice setting out requirements would be very beneficial for public authorities. In terms of some of the challenges that can be foreseen is around the resource challenges to support that public proactive publication duty, and also where there is less autonomy through a code of practice on the tools or systems that each public authority can utilise to deliver that, may bring some challenges as well, where many public authorities have different ways and means of publication and achieving that duty.
So do you believe that the public sector is ready to implement such a duty in terms of resourcing, technical expertise, finance, culture? All those?
I think that's a challenging question. I've worked in various types of organisations, but representing the Law Society, it may depend on the type of organisation and the structure and the resources available to it. So I think the key for a code of practice is to give that degree of autonomy for key requirements to be delivered in line with the tools available to the public authority in question.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask now about the Freedom of Information Officer and designating one in every Scottish public authority. So that proposal is there for each public authority. It draws on a model from records management and data protection law. I think we've heard that already. So, Chris, you mentioned specifically in one of your responses about small start-ups within the university sector. So bearing in mind that sort of thing, how feasible is designating this role for public authorities of different sizes or within different models of freedom of information delivery?
I think it could work if it was to mirror in part the provisions of the UK General Data Protection Regulation, which codifies when a data protection officer is and isn't required. Mm-hmm. And it would be useful for Parliament, obviously, and the Commissioner and others to think about what organisations would benefit by having such an officer. I think in some instances it would be useful for larger organisations to have that. And it could be particularly useful if the Commissioner had found that a public authority had difficulty in meeting its obligations. That might be one way of generating improvement and getting expertise so that the transparency that the public and Parliament require has got more chance of being successful.
Oh, thank you. Do you think there could be scope for some to not have some exemptions to be...
I think so. I saw in one of the submissions that I'd read outside the group submission that GP practices, and I felt that was a particularly good example.
Okay, thanks. Fiona, yourself.
Yes, thank you. We're supportive of this in principle and note it does mirror to some extent the provisions of the Statutory Data Protection Officer. I would support that view around considering if there's any particular areas of exemption or indeed reflecting on some of the provisions of the Statutory Data Protection Officer that haven't been included here, which could be for certain types of public authorities to share the resource, given their size and types of information they hold, for example.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you, Sue. Chris, can I just ask about, you mentioned obviously university spin-offs. What happens about the GDPR individual at the moment with regard to those spin-offs? Is it still a centralised one at university level, or is there a... I mean, obviously there's a trigger point when it literally does spin away and become its own company, but what happens in that transitional period?
So it would all depend on who the controller was. I can talk for how it operates at the University of St Andrews. If there are spin-offs which are entirely separate in their own right, as Data Protection Officer for the University, I would give support to that spin-off, and it's part of the University's support to help get companies up and running.
Because in essence there is that exchange of data which makes it sensible to do it that way, which lends not dissimilarly to the proposal and the freedom of information. That's really helpful. Fiona, can I come to you as having provided us with such an excellent content of where we're going today, and move to the offences element of it? Because obviously there is a proposal to create an offence of altering records with a specific intent to prevent disclosure. What do you see about the challenges for that?
Yes, thank you. I think the Law Society has highlighted some operational concerns, but also through the Criminal Law Committee have highlighted some concerns around how this might operate in practice and potentially result in some legal uncertainty in terms of its enforcement, particularly based on the fact that through the the necessity of intent, there is no detail of how that would be proved within the bill. And also, currently the courts interpret that through inference, and just the nature of the offence, it is difficult to see how that may be proven where, for example, somebody's following their records management schedule, for example, and also just because the criminal burden is beyond reasonable doubt as well. It is not clear how likely that is for there to be a prosecution. It may actually be rare in terms of its enforceability. In terms of operational concerns, there is a concern that it might discourage people from genuinely recording business critical decisions for fear of them unintentionally committing offence, which would actually work against the concepts of openness and transparency. There is also a potential tension between two pieces of legislation, this and UK GDPR, where you have one of the key principles about storage limitation, and that you must not keep personal data for longer than is necessary, and that's normally as set out in retention schedules. So again, if somebody was to apply the retention schedule, how would that fit in terms of the potential offence here? Also, we have to understand that as we increase our technology capabilities, many systems are introduced with automated retention, which again I think poses some challenges to this. Just a couple of other points, if that's okay. There's also the potential for this to have additional storage costs if there is the need to keep information for longer. And as all public authorities are aware, one of the greatest risks are not only data breach but cyber attacks, and therefore it is not a good position where we're seen to be keeping data for longer than we need to, because that can expose the risk in that space as well. So I think that summarises the Law Society's position.
Thank you, Fiona. Can I just come back to you before I come to Chris about the period of prosecution, in a sense, because there's a proposal that it effectively 3 years, but the 3 years runs from the criminal investigation rather than the date of the offence. What's the Law Society's view on that?
So yes, I think the Law Society's view was around making sure we were clear about what the commencement of a criminal investigation means in terms of any other time periods. Because I don't sit on the Criminal Law Committee, I'm more than happy to go back and make sure that we get a definitive response from the criminal law experts.
Yeah, so always ask the experts. Chris, I mean, what's your view with regard to this potential criminal offence?
Yeah. The group's view is this is probably one of the areas that gave us the largest cause for concern. We feel that the legislation currently has quite sufficient strengths, and this would probably result in some of the unintended consequences that Fiona's outlined: people not destroying information, increased costs, risks. It would actually also make the complex, well, ironically, the more information an organisation has, sorry, I'm deviating from the group's response, but it just came to mind. The more unstructured that information may be, even with technology, the chances are you'd see an increase in Section 12 notices saying it's going to cost too much to provide the request, and you might see more requests being refused if organisations start to deviate from good records management practices and there's not the efficient destruction and timely destruction of information.
So do you think at the moment effectively the public statement of the importance of FOI, which ties into the importance of proper record management, is sufficiently strong to say, you know, any hint at a deliberate attempt to alter or prevent someone having access to this would be frowned upon, without the need for explicitly in primary legislation saying this would be a criminal offence?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. As a practitioner and also a records manager, I'm kind of obviously afraid with the legislation and of the practicalities of records retention and destruction in a way that the public may not be. So I can see how the mechanics of this work in the background and understand why the law presently has sufficient control. I think when the public perhaps look at media reports about and people form their own perceptions of views, particularly following the COVID inquiry, of what may or may not have happened with automated destruction of messages from social media platforms. I can see in that instance why trust and confidence is eroded. I'm not sure this proposal would specifically address or take that forward in a meaningful way. I think there's more downsides to the proposal than there are upsides.
That's very helpful. Katie, can I come to you?
And I'll just ask about one aspect of the bill for time reasons, if that's okay, which is the new offence, which we've just been discussing. So the offence is crafted to address an identified problem and designed to have a deterrent effect. And we obviously knew that there were going to be FOI requests about how the Scottish Government had dealt with COVID, and that is the particular scenario that really has led to this provision. There's already existing criminal offences in the 2002 Act, and I just wanted to ask whether you've got experience of working with those offences, because this provision has been crafted in the same way. So I just wonder whether you've got any practical experience of dealing with scenarios that have led to prosecutions under that Act, because it's rarely used.
Yeah, certainly no, not from an institutional perspective or from the perspective of the practitioners that we network with. But as you asked the question there, if I may, one thing that kind of came to mind, if there are public emergencies such as COVID or other foreseen scenarios, one way of managing that perhaps might be, obviously universities aren't subject to the public records legislation that other public authorities are, but there might be provision in that legislation to codify retention periods for specific records that ought to be created where those scenarios arise. So essentially a record's created or received where there is a business process. So if it was foreseen that something was happening, there might be provision in another Act to say this is what Parliament requires in terms of the retention and management of that record, or it may be something that could be devolved to the Keeper of the Records of Scotland, apologies if I've got the title incorrect, to then issue guidance under any codes of practice or powers that that office has to express how something ought to be managed, so that, I don't want to prejudge the COVID inquiry or any other inquiry, but if it was found that there had been proactive destruction of information to prevent public scrutiny of important matters, that there's a mechanism to deal with that.
Fiona?
Yes, I haven't had experience of that offence either, and again, this is a point I can go back for wider views if that's helpful to committee, and also the Law Society share the views around perhaps the focus on good records management practice and greater clarity on what is required to be kept. I think that combined with some sort of view that within public authorities, people should continue to record information in line with retention, and the legislation is clear, supported by Commissioner decisions, that if an exemption applies, then it applies, that may assist.
Thank you.
Can I thank both witnesses today? If there's anything that comes to mind afterwards, you know how to get in touch with us, and I hope you don't mind, particularly from the point of view of Fiona, that we may come back to you with other questions in the near future. But can I thank you for your evidence today? I'm also at this stage going to release Ruth Maguire from the committee, and then I'm going to move this committee into private.